So in this segment, we're going to be discussing more than 90% of the levelling up funding has not yet been spent. So the UK government has spent less than 10% of its 4.8 billion levelling up fund since its launch in 2020. According to official figures, the figures obtained by the Labour Party show £392 million has been spent from the fund as of last month. The fund awarded £1.7 billion to projects in October 2021 and another £2.1 billion in January 2023. The Levelling Up Department said it has always been clear that councils will receive funding over time. So they allocated £1.7 billion in October 2021 and barely any of it's been spent. Hardly anything. What's going on there? So, over the three years they've had to get the ball rolling on this, they claimed before some of the funds were not going to be rolled out until the final EU funds were gone, so the levelling up funds would just replace the lost EU funds in equal level. That didn't happen, or happened too late, because some of the schemes have been forced to wind up due to the lack of funds. This is something I've covered before, so the arguments that Gove used in the Levelling Up Department is wild. It added that money from the fund's latest spending round, allocated in January, is due to be spent over at least 3 financial years. It is part of the wider Levelling Up idea, which aims to reduce the economic opportunity between different regions by improving transport, education and broadband. The term, coined by former Prime Minister Johnson, was a central theme of the Conservatives' pitch to voters outside of London at the 2019 election. End quote. And I get there was COVID, but still there were projects funded by EU structural funds going on, so the Tories have no excuse. Infrastructure projects would boost the economy as well. These types of projects can enable people to get around easier, giving them access to better travel and spend money, and enable them to get potentially better work opportunities as well. Growing local economies, something the Tories don't understand. Labour submitted a Freedom of Information request to ask the government to confirm how much of the 4.8 billion allocated to the fund has been spent. In response, the government said a total of 224 million had been spent as of the 18th of January 2023, with the figure rising to 392 million by February 2022. And I'm surprised Labour got anywhere with the Freedom of Information request. We know that Gove is angry at the Treasury for wrapping up the Levelling Up Department in red tape, so maybe this is his way of getting back at them for this. To say we have not spent much, but he does not give the Treasury his excuse as to why the spending hasn't been high. He seems to argue the money is on its way and has been allocated to councils already. They just haven't yet spent the money, and the financial year, I think it's not quite ended yet. Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy revealed the figures as MPs put questions to government ministers in Parliament. She compared the cost of the government's decision to give high earners pension tax breaks in the budget earlier this month to the money it spent on levelling up. Nandy said, quote, They can get their act together when it comes to the 1%, when it comes to investment in our local transport, decent housing, and even on delivering on a single one of the levelling up missions. Why is it the rest of us always have to wait? End quote. And she's right. These plans for the pensioners were not a manifesto promise. They're being rushed through very quickly and going to cost the taxpayer a lot of money. Economically, it's not worth it. Whilst levelling up was an election pledge, but we have seen little to no results. So, decent attack line from the Labour Party. I do want to see what they will do differently in terms of, levelling up and kind of decentralisation of powers. But, what Lisa Nandy said is absolutely correct. The Liberal Democrats said the government's levelling up plans are, quote, are a shambles. Ultimately, the buck stops with Michael Gove. He has overseen a systemic failure to provide much needed funding to dozens of communities across the country, end quote, the party's local government spokesperson Helen Morgan said. And look, I don't like Gove at all, but I think this is more down to Jeremy Hunt. By making it so that all of the levelling up programmes go through the Treasury, it slows down the programmes, but also means Gove has to justify more of his decisions. The Treasury sets the funding as well, and we know that some of the projects have gone over budget because of inflation and the time these projects are taking. These projects are suffering from rapid inflation, a lack of skilled staff as well. No doubt that's made things worse. So I don't know how much of this is to blame Michael Gove. Swaps in kind of Treasury and different kind of the last prime ministers we've had. I don't want to be sympathetic to Gove, but I don't think this is 100% his fault. I think the fault is with the Treasury. But Levelling Up Secretary Gove defended the government's record, arguing Chancellor Jeremy Hunt had made sure millions of pounds would be spent in his budget. And I mean, sure, that's great. You really only have one financial year to show results because you think an election is going to take place at the end of 2024. So you have one full financial year. and a year and a half really. The town I live in, it will take around 18 months for the levelling up project to be done, which if the Tories are lucky will chime in with the election. But these sorts of projects are normally get delayed, and I've not seen much work done yet apart from some fencing being put up, and millions of pounds versus the entire of the UK won't get you very far. They love touting big figures without any context, and no one in the media seems to call them out on it. How much can £10 million get you around the UK in terms of infrastructure? But some politicians have complained about the process for allocating the money. Andy Street, the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands, criticised the funding process, calling it a, quote, broken begging bowl culture, end quote. He suggested the money would have been allocated better by local decision makers than civil servants in London. And, setting up a system for the bids is not the easiest, but having clear criteria would have made sense, which the Tories do not have. Perhaps looking at the EU model and seeing where we can improve on that, which is something the Tories didn't do. Look at the areas of need where they really need help. The issues with local government is that it's easier to corrupt local government, but they generally know more about what the locals want. It's kind of a double-edged sword in that sense. I think the two have to work together, civil servants in London, ministers in London, but also local government officials. I think the bids have to be transparent, why they're accepted or rejected, but it can't be London just telling the other areas what they need. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has said, quote, levelling up adds little value to London communities, and called the process for allocating funds, quote, an unmitigating nightmare, end quote. Labour said it would end the, quote, competitive style bidding, end quote, process, but would not cancel projects that had already been approved. And the scheme is not aimed at London, so it makes sense. So, I don't know why he's getting so mad about it, Sadiq Khan, I mean. It makes sense for Labour to keep the projects, even if they're not the best use of money, because you just have half-baked projects that'd be an eyesore. I'm not mad about the competitive style bidding, because I think you've got to, you need areas to come up with, decent bids for the projects. I think competition can help that, but I think it's got to be more based on need than anything. And local communities have to say how they're going to spend the money and how it will benefit them. Sunak has argued that the most deprived areas would benefit from the money. In January, Sunak said his government was committed to levelling up, quote, across the UK, end quote, and denied politics had influenced the allocation of funds. Quote, I think around half the funding we have announced over the course of today, or both funds, have actually gone to places that are not controlled by Conservative MPs or councils, end quote, he said at the time. And I mean, we know that the funds are politically allocated, with most of the money going to Tory areas instead of Labour areas that actually need the money more. Sunak admitted that he diverted money from meant for deprived Labour areas into wealthier Tory areas. So, the arguments he makes no sense. And, you can argue that there is money going to Labour areas, but there is way more money going to Tory areas. He has a track record of, funneling money to funneling funds to kind of Tory areas that don't need it as much. And, we've covered that before. The funds are not based on need, but the Tory desire to placate voters in swing seats in order to keep winning elections. And that's the truth of it, in my opinion. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.